All right, well, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. My name is Aaron. Nice to thank you all for coming out for our 2025 Great Decisions set of programs. Really very glad to see a large crowd out today. It's nice. We're trying really hard to kind of spread the word, so please tell all your friends. Encourage everyone to come out. Bring a friend. More the better. So, I will say officially then, I guess it is afternoon, so we can say good afternoon now to our Great Decisions Global Speaker and Discussion Series. And I am very excited, along with the rest of our committee, to kick off our 2025 season. So, Corinne, are you here? I was trying to remember, when did we start? How long have we been going? Like mid-80s? Good 4 decades anyway then, right? So here we are, like 4 decades in, and we're still here doing this wonderful programming, and I'm very excited to be part of it now. And as I said, my name is Aaron Nicely. I am the chair of our committee, so on behalf of our Great Decisions chapter, I just want to say thanks for coming out today. We literally could not do this without you, obviously, and it means so much to have you with us today. And I also want to take a moment to thank our various sponsors and supporters throughout the community, including the Delaware County District Library, the League of Women Voters, Main Street, Delaware, and our hosts here at William Street United Methodist Church, our home for all of these 4 decades, and we thank them in particular for that. The Willowbrook Christian Communities as a sponsor, and countless businesses and organizations throughout our beautiful city. And for all of you that are part of those organizations, likewise, you are what makes Delaware one of the fastest growing and most vibrant cities and counties in the country. And we really appreciate your support as well. The Great Decisions program centers on a very simple premise. We set out to provide a thoughtful, nonpartisan, and intellectually engaged space for the residents of our county to discuss about the great decisions of our time, the global affairs that are confronting our community, our state, our country, and truthfully, the world. As I like to say, we are bringing the world to William Street, and we're glad to keep that going. And we have an incredible 2025 Great Decisions season ahead. Over the coming 8 weeks, we're going to travel the world exploring the great decisions of our time, we'll say. We're starting with the future of American foreign policy. We're going to have topics addressing U.S.-China relations, international climate change cooperation, evolving U.S. leadership in the global economy, American foreign policy in the Middle East, the questions of artificial intelligence and its implications for national security and international relations, the future of NATO and European security, something that's a bit in the news lately, and a very fascinating look to round out our season with a look at the country of India, the world's largest democracy, and its increasing geopolitical role on the world stage. And I have to say, we are so fortunate to be located where we are in Central Ohio. If you think about the cornucopia of universities and colleges we have, Ohio State, Ohio Wesleyan, we draw so much from both of those institutions, but we also have other institutions like Kenyon, Denison, Oberlin, a little further, Otterbein, even Ohio University, as some of you know from previous years. People have made the drive all the way from Athens to join us. And it's just wonderful to be able to gather this brain trust of insights and ability to engage with some of these leading scholars and thinkers on some of these topics. And I do want to put in a quick plug, though. If you'd like to read about this at home, we do have a way for you to do that. Over here on the table, thank you, Marcy, we do have the Great Decisions briefing books. These are published by the Foreign Policy Association, our national sponsor for this. Well, we do sell them here, a few of them at cost. We don't get any money from it, $35. Or you can buy them online, either a hard copy or now there is an electronic copy again this year, finally. If you'd like to have a reader, something where you can read it on a tablet or your phone, etc. So if you'd like that, please see Marcy up here at the table, and we can get you all set with that as well. Now with that, I want to introduce today's session, which is a very special session to me. It's starting last year. We titled this the Reverend Ward Skip Cornett III Great Decisions Memorial Lecture. So Skip Cornett, for many of you that knew him. He was a former chair of the Great Decisions chapter here in Delaware from 2020 to 2023, and a member of the committee for even longer. Skip earned a Master of Sacred Theology degree from Trinity Lutheran Seminary, a bachelor's degree in political science from Marshall University, and he also was a Lutheran pastor, ordained through the Lutheran School of Theology. Throughout his career, he served in the United States Coast Guard as a chaplain until his retirement. And when I think about Skip, there is no better way to describe him than to simply say he was, without a doubt, one of the good guys. He was a passionate advocate for social justice, for equity, for interfaith relations and global peace. He and his family traveled the world promoting that message of citizenship and friendship for all. He was a person that I knew as a person with dignity and humility and a fundamental human decency that will forever stand as an example for all of us. So simply put, he was our colleague and Skip was my friend. And when he unfortunately did die in July 2023, we decided as a way to honor his enduring legacy, we named our first lecture of every year after Skip as the Great Decisions Memorial Lecture. And I do want to acknowledge and thank his wife Becky for being with us yet again this year, and I am very grateful you can make it, Becky. Okay, now with that, to the main event. I'm very excited to introduce today's Great Decisions presenter, Dr. Christopher McKnight-Nichols. Get my notes back there. He is a professor of history and the Wayne Woodrow Hayes Chair in National Security Studies at the Merson Center for International Security Studies at Ohio State University. He specializes in the history of the United States and its relationship to the rest of the world, with a focus on the history of isolationism, internationalism, and globalization. Topics that are very much on our mind today. And honestly, Chris, we could take an entire hour listening to your accomplishments. I want everyone to listen to just a few of the things that our speaker, Chris, here has achieved. He is an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, the Andrew Carnegie Fellow, a past member of the Board of Trustees of the Oregon Historical Society, a member of the Council of the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, one of my favorite eras. And most recently, he's been elected to the Council of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. And finally, he is a lifetime member of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Chris is the author of, or editor, I should say, of 6 books, including a highly regarded book that I'm eager to read, actually, titled Promise and Peril, America at the Dawn of a Global Age, and another recent book titled Rethinking American Grand Strategy. His latest book is titled U.S. Foreign Relations, New Histories. It was recently awarded the International Studies Association's 2023 Joseph Fletcher Prize for Best Edited Book in Historical International Relations. That is a mouthful of the title, but a very nice award. He's been a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, National Public Radio, and most importantly, he's an award-winning teacher. So Chris, my only question to you is, when do you sleep? Seriously, that's a lot. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris McKnight-Nichols to the podium for today's great decision on American foreign policy at a global crossroads. All right, all yours.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you. It's wonderful to see you all out thinking together about a topic of great interest to me and to us all, hopefully. I always want to say at the outset thank you to the great organizers who've been in touch, but also thank you to you all. We were just talking about how it's very hard to figure out how to get people out anymore. We don't often come together as a group to think or talk, and it's a real honor to have anyone devote any of their time of their day to think together in community with others. So just want to thank you for coming out. Thanks for the kind introduction, and if you haven't read John Eikenberry's piece on this subject in the Great Decisions pamphlet, I recommend it. I'll be sort of pulling from it as I speak. I've done these these conversations a few times on the West Coast with World Affairs Councils, so I'm happy to be here doing it in Ohio with you all. I only came to Ohio about 3 years ago to take up the Woody Hayes chair, which had been, no, they couldn't fill it. There was a lot of debates as to who should hold the chair, so I'm honored to be the Woody Hayes Chair in National Security Studies at Ohio State. Without further ado, let's jump in and think together about the challenges to the U.S. and the world right now. So, by some metrics, the U.S. is doing as well as it has in a long time. Seemingly, the U.S. Is on a firm footing economically. Unemployment's low, around 4%. The Biden administration, for a four-year president, had the most quarter-over-quarter job growth of any four-year president. If you look around, inflation is now finally somewhat under control, running roughly in the 2% range. We could go on with some of the measures by which you could understand the U.S. to be in good shape, in fact. This could be arguably an optimistic moment. And yet I bet most of you are feeling pessimistic in some way, shape, or form, right? So what are some of the measures of that? We have rising numbers of Americans who don't believe in democracy, who don't trust the news, who don't believe that elections are fair and proper. And fundamentally, we have a real divide in American public life about agreeing on facts, right? Some basics that were there in the mid-century moment that may have been unique. It may have been a phenomenon that we shouldn't have taken so lightly. But in any case, in our current moment, with the sort of velocity of change, of information, with the ways in which technology has altered how we understand information, Americans are as divided, as polarized as they've ever been. That all feeds into a set of global challenges. Anyone over a certain age knows that there have been debates and crisis moments, reciprocally, serially, often in U.S. history, right? This isn't the first time the U.S. has to debate its role in the world. In that book, volume okay? Volume okay? I can go higher, but I know I've got a mic. So this isn't the first time. In that book, Promise and Peril, America at the Dawn of a Global Age, I charted how at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, the debates for the U.S.'s role in the world fundamentally changed. Those changes were premised on American power, commercial as well as military, and a rising sense of the U.S.'s cultural role in the world. And then the question became for Americans circa 1898, the war with Spain, how should the U.S. wield its power? And the thing that's animated my work and helps me understand questions like this, right, the sort of cartoonish ways in which we are actually confronted with some profound questions, is to say, how is the meaning of America instantiated in foreign relations? Americans don't really agree today on what the meaning of the U.S. is, and therefore they don't agree on what the U.S.'s role in the world should be. We have a fundamental divide on what the meaning of the U.S. is. This is something that Eikenberry talks about in his piece. What are the principles and core values that guide American democracy? There have been other moments when this was contested in U.S. history, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those. But if you think about these caricatures, right, Pax Americana, this is Donald Trump. This is from 2017. So after his first inauguration, in his first administration, Russia and China wobbling there. Are they going to pick up the ball of the globe of Pax Americana, and Uncle Sam struggling under the weight of it, right? Superficially, a set of straightforward questions: is that any longer worth shouldering? Under the surface, there are a lot of reasons to think through the costs and benefits of U.S. world leadership, and even to trouble the very sort of conception of what we're talking about today. My colleague John Muller has said, maybe the Pax Americana is fundamentally a myth. It is located in a view of the U.S.'s world leadership that's based on a counterfactual. That is, there could have been an alternative to the U.S. taking a leadership role in the world after the Second World War. And if the U.S. had stepped back, by what measures could we figure out if there would or wouldn't have been more or less peace in the world? So we have the one control experiment of how history has unfolded, right? And we rely on that when we talk about the liberal world order. But we don't necessarily know the truth of whether or not the U.S.'s large base structures, 18 bases around the world, large investments in the military-industrial complex, role in all kinds of international organizations was the deciding factor in this, right? I have my own views, but it's worth being a little skeptical to start as we think about what is world order? Is it collapsing? Because that's what's the conversations in foreign relations circles in D.C., in New York, in in London, in Beijing, are all about the collapse of the current world order. So thinking about what were the sort of core constituent parts, it's incumbent on us all to think skeptically about what they were, how they've unfolded, and not just assume that the US leadership role is why we got to this point. I think it's a big part of it, to be honest with you, but you could also imagine other ways of understanding this history that don't rely on the so-called liberal world order, rules-based order, as we think of them. That is the WTO, the UN, other structures like that. So, but we're in this moment in part because of rising skepticism in the US. The reason that I got it all famous ever was because I was the guy who was writing about isolationism when nobody was. Right around 2004, 5, 6, in the wake of 9/11, everybody was talking about internationalism. Everybody was talking about a flattened world. Remember that Tom Friedman concept? Nobody was talking about border making and nationalism and the US history and deep enduring values of isolationism. But they were there, and they sure have come back, right? And so the core thing about the great decisions of the current moment is the skepticism, the wide skepticism of the American public right now about international binding collective security agreements, international energy accords, climate change questions, the inability to deal with COVID-19 as a global community. You know, I have up there the image of America First from 1940 and 41. That's something else I've done a lot of research on and thought about. The ways in which those folks then have echoes through the present of being skeptical of the US having alliances with other countries and being bound to other countries to defend them, for instance. That the US should go its own way in the world in a unilateral or transactional sense. We see that in the administration right now. All the new executive orders, all of that is premised on some bedrock set of principles about the US acting alone as a single power in the world. Whatever you think of that, that's what's happening. And you look through the sorts of governance structures and bodies, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the first collective security agreement the US joined since the Revolutionary War, skepticism about that, right? The question is, have we become, as Americans, very complacent about our place in this system and the benefits it's accrued to the US? Or have we actually over-invested in this system, and is there some room for retrenchment? Those are some of the core kinds of questions. You can also think through the ways in which collective security operates and dovetails with collective economic organization. So I have the Trans-Pacific Partnership. When Donald Trump came first into office, he immediately pulled out of that. Skepticism that the US should be a regional leader in a multilateral way in Asia. Instead, he argued bilateral, and his administration, bilateral deals would do the same for the US and get the US more benefits. So those are the core premises. And we've seen the US pulling out of all sorts of these organizations or renegotiating them. NAFTA is another example. I think in the background of all this, if we're thinking of the world since World War II, in the background of all of this is the 1990s. Is coming out of the Cold War. If you were involved in the foreign relations world, the questions revolved around where's the nation state headed, where are international organizations going, and how will the structures of the Cold War endure in a post-Cold War era. And the skepticism that was borning in the 1990s is very much where we reside today. It's amplified. There's a widening of a path already in view, and that's what Eichenberry, a Princeton political scientist, wrote in the packet. And there's a couple flashpoint areas that we could see this right now in the abrupt changes of US foreign policy, most clearly. Ukraine is a great example. Ukraine, Russia, Europe, NATO. Who has the most stake in the war? How does the US's collective security agreements like NATO operate? Should that organization have expanded as it did? It's actually expanded now because of Putin's war, which is an interesting sort of way of understanding the way other nations view their own security in light of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So this is one key flashpoint to think about, that there's the real difference in American foreign policy circles about how to deal with this. There's huge differences within the Republican Party about how to deal with Ukraine, and that's a first place to think about where these transitions are coming and where they're headed. So we've seen, for instance, you all have probably been following the news, that the US has begun bilateral conversations in Saudi Arabia with Russia, leaving out Ukraine's leaders. The sort of post-World War II view of that was that, yes, the great powers would decide a lot of these things, but that the smaller powers would have a seat at the table. So that's actually quite new to think of it in this way, a bilateral deal to begin peace negotiations or cede territory without them having a seat at the table. And of course, eventually they'll have to be signatories, right? But it says something about how the US is now approaching its role in the world. So too with NATO, Europe right now, European leaders are scrambling, as you may have heard and know, to figure out how they can fund the war in Ukraine in the absence of US support and leadership. So that's the other piece of this. What happens as the US withdraws? What does the vacuum of US power look like? So that caricature there, if you're a believer in US hegemony or primacy, as people talk about it, having the Pax Americana, if you're a believer in that, you absolutely don't want to see China or Russia take up any of that world leadership role. If you're not a believer in that, you may not care much. And a big part of that is the argument that safeguarding America does not require those kinds of international agreements and commitments. That American principles stop at water's edge, as they used to say in the 19th century, as foreign policy supposedly did too. That politics within the country could be divisive, but politics outside of its borders was more clear to Americans. That is certainly not true today. So I'll give you one more that's obviously a flashpoint issue. Israel, the Palestinians, Hamas, and Gaza. We're now in a ceasefire. Right, but what is the U.S.'s proper role as a mediator in this conflict? Should the U.S. play a role at all? Right, so I'm just taking this at a sort of neutral overview perspective. What does it mean for the U.S. to play a role with the UN, to veto resolutions that would sanction Israel, for instance, until the U.S. chooses not to? What are the ethics of financial and military aid to countries at war, particularly in this kind of conflict, right? Continuing to send arms to Israel. What is the transition from the Biden administration to the Trump administration hearken or signify if you think about the ways in which the Biden administration was critiqued for its close relations with Israel, and there's arguably been no president who gave Israel more of a free hand than Donald Trump in his first administration. So what does that suggest for the sorts of alliances and negotiations that are possible in this period? And then what do Americans actually think? And it was fascinating to see how views evolved on Gaza, on the wake of the terrorist attacks by Hamas. First, a ton of support for Israel and its right to self-defense, and then slowly appealing back. And again, whatever you think about this set of issues, never in my lifetime has the plight of Palestinians been as much of a conversation talking point as it is today, right? So that if you look at the way that public opinion has changed on this, it is altered fundamentally because of Israel's actions and because of the way, particularly how it's been covered. But that hasn't really penetrated U.S. foreign policy circles. I've done a bunch of events with State Department figures and others. They're not taking on board that coverage too much. They're not much concerned with American popular opinion, Biden administration and Trump administration. So this is another place to look as two sort of flashpoint areas to think about, what are the great decisions to be made and what will they signify for the future. So in the piece, John Eikenberry lays out, look, the U.S. is a polarized, divided nation facing all sorts of challenges, dangers, and uncertainties, for sure, right? This is like a fact, a very basic observation. He argues that since the 1930s, the two parties in the U.S. have never been more split on the most basic questions. This is sort of what I was noting to start, of identity, principles, and policies. That leads to these enormous divides whereby some people, count individuals who affiliate with another party as an enemy, as people they won't talk to over the dinner table or have all kinds of problems with, falling out among friends and family, right? We know this. Historians' job is always to say, hey, it's been worse before. That's where I often start, right? Okay, the problem is almost all the it's been worse before examples make us very fearful in this moment. So the first one would be the 1840s and 1850s in U.S. politics. There may have been no more principled set of differences than the issues over slavery in the 1840s and 1850s. It's a great book by my colleague at Yale, Joanne Freeman, on the political violence of the 1840s and 1850s. You want to think about an era of assassinations and threats and people actually fighting in Congress? That's where you go, right? The caning of Sumner, you know some of these stories, right? There was a duel that actually killed a congressman. It's a mess in the 1840s and 1850s. We're not that bad in right now. So we can hope, I don't know. But we all know what's coming in that 1840s, 1850s moment, right? The worst fractures to American society, the largest casualties in war, collectively more U.S. casualties in the Civil War than in all other wars combined. So that's not a great comparison, but that's one place that it's been worse. Also, in that moment, you had partisan press. You had press that was speaking to its echo chambers, siloed media. In fact, abolitionist tracts couldn't even be sent into the South. The media was censored, the journalism was censored, and the journalists were threatened. Famously, William Lloyd Garrison and others like him and the Liberator were kept out of the discussions. 1840s, 1850s are also a moment of really important foreign policy. I could go on for a long time. We could just talk about that. I'm sure you don't want to hear about it, but a brief synopsis. This is a transition when the representatives of the slave powers were slowly losing their roles in foreign policy making. They were no longer becoming the secretaries of state as much. They were no longer having the majorities in Congress that they had enjoyed before. So they enacted things like the gag rule, so you couldn't talk about slavery in Congress. And they pushed really hard for annexation of new territories that would become slave states because they needed to keep their majorities. If you think about gerrymandering in the US, if you think about other things in our current moment, when a minority is feels it is so under pressure, it stands to reason that then they will take extraordinary measures to hold their power. And the 1840s and 1850s, especially in foreign policy, is one of those. The U.S. is trying to buy Cuba in this period, for instance. Polk tries to buy Cuba. That actually started with Jefferson. He also tried to buy Cuba. And then there were debates back and forth. Should Cuba be bought and be a slave state, or could the sugar plantations actually be advantageous and be a place for wage labor? There's a whole lot of other things like that. All right, another one would be the late 19th century. This is one of my preferred ones, Gilded Age and Progressive era. It's an era of rising powers in the world system. The British Empire is declining, although it still sort of has a hegemonic role, and the U.S. wants to be a major power. One of my favorite letters that's in a couple of my articles in my books is that I found from Teddy Roosevelt, where he says, "I'll take a war with Spain, but what I want is a war with Germany." Why he said that wasn't just anti-German bias, but because they were seen as a rising power co-equal with the U.S. in 1898, roughly. And a power that was scientific and highly educated in the sort of Anglo-Saxon sphere, as they would have thought of it then in their racial hierarchical thinking. And so the late 19th century is a moment where there's lots of tension between nation states, the beginnings of collective security agreements, the Hague Conventions, the beginning of thinking about human rights and the laws of war in the sort of modern international organizational senses. And you also had really fractured politics. You had disenfranchisement of black people in the South. You had a rising clamor for the women getting the vote, but still that was over 20 years away. And you had progressive reformers dueling with their antagonists in all kinds of ways within American society. The results of that's probably our most optimistic one. It takes a few decades to get to any major global conflagration, and the U.S. actually does okay in that set of comparisons. It's unlike the current thing, so you'll hear about U.S.-China and a bunch of other talks, and that's in the paper. People often ask us foreign policy scholars, hey, is this a Cold War? Is this just like the Cold War? And almost all of us say no, and then it's a question of what era do we point to? Because there just aren't the same markers between the US and the Soviet Union as there are with the US and China right now. The interdependence with China is fundamentally and radically different. Right? Anything that happens terribly to the US right now also has radical and terrible complications for China. Think about supply chain and everything else. They're trying to figure out how to be more self-sufficient, but they are not. Right? They're globally integrated as much as any economy on the planet. Soviet Union, totally different, right? Absolutely different. They could exist without global trade. They did not need the democratic capitalist systems. So the antagonisms also took different shape. So I prefer late 19th century. Rising powers, maybe a clear hegemon. So in this case, the British are the US, attempting to keep some order in the world system. And it takes until 1914 till you get World War I. All right, here's another one. 20s and 30s. This is what Eichenberry points to, although he doesn't elaborate it. Coming out of a pandemic, 1918, 1919, coming out of a world war, okay, not quite as good of a comparison, a bunch of contentious elections, you get a return to normalcy, which feels a lot like today. You see the rise of the Klan, you see the rise of America Firsters, you see the rise of immigration restriction, tighter border controls, 20s and 30s look a lot more like our current moment in a lot of ways. Economy is good in the 20s, tanks in the 30s for all the obvious reasons. We could talk more about it. But you also see the seeds of global competition throughout the 20s. There's disarmament conferences, but there's also a sense of, Mussolini's rise is the early 1920s in Italy, right? Fascism is looking more attractive to a bunch of countries, authoritarianism. So that's one I would point us to think with and think through as we're thinking about historical moments. And I could belabor or answer more when we're chatting more. Yeah, and then the other question is the early Cold War. Is this a moment like coming out of a realignment of systems where something was built and then had to be reshaped? I was just talking to students about this. The World War II moment, 1940 to 44, American thinkers want to reshape the world order in a system that they were thinking until 1944 as a federation, not the UN. In 45, it suddenly becomes clear to American policymakers that the Soviet Union is going to be a big threat. So people like John Foster Dulles, great theological thinkers like Reinhold Niebuhr, the shift from FDR to Truman, they all begin to think that the U.S. can't give up any sovereignty, actually, in the UN. The U.S. needs to have a veto power. The U.S. needs to have a structure to push back against Soviet and communist systems as they develop in the international system. In some ways, the early Cold War, then, this shift from the kind of hopefulness of, now this is my comparison to the near past, the kind of 90s, we've done away with nationalism, we've done away with the nation state, unlikely to have large-scale conflict. Those hopes have been dashed on the reality of things like the war in Ukraine, Russian aggression, the way Israel has responded to the attacks of Hamas, et cetera. So the early Cold War is a moment where you can think about one realignment and a set of hopes, and then another one setting in. We could talk about that. That's like a lot of big structural stuff. Bretton Woods system, currency, like these are on the table, right? Is the US dollar still going to be the dominant currency in the international system in the near future? Probably. In the midterm and longer future? Probably not. Most are predicting. But what replaces it, right? And how can you have guarantees that whatever replaces it is like the dollar, right? Is as consistent and it functions through a reasonable democratic process that's transparent for the world to see. So this is kind of what Eichenberg sets up for us in The Great Decisions, and he lays out a few main ways of understanding it. So he argues that we're living in a world of something like 3 major crises. And he's a political scientist, so social scientist, thinker. He likes to list things out, three of these and 6 of those and that sort of thing. But I think they're quite illuminating. So the first is the crises of geopolitics. They're the things that I've already mentioned and that you know in your head, right? A return to kind of power politics, the ways in which major countries are going back and forth against each other, China and the US, Russia, great power politics and antagonism, including things like pulling out of previous nuclear accords, modernizing nuclear weapons. One thing that is really concerning to the non-proliferation community is China's modernization of its nuclear weapons and building programs. They will soon be a peer competitor in terms of nuclear weapons with the US and Russia. So, that's great power politics at its most hard power, right? Nuclear weapons, the ability to destroy the world, has returned. The other is a crisis of modernity, as he calls it. This he sees as a kind of set of interlocking challenges of our current moment, economic, security, environmental, that these sort of modern elements, climate change, of the interdependence of economies, of supply chains, the interdependence that makes us vulnerable, like pandemics, are all of a piece. And these challenges, crises of modernity, are leading to individuals having what they said in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, modern doubt. They have doubt about their societies. They have doubt about the facts. They have doubt about their futures. The youngest people in the U.S. no longer have the life expectancy of the oldest people in the U.S. So the lowest quintile in the U.S. is more likely to die at an earlier age than the highest quintile, right? Same thing with social mobility. For the first time in the last 100+ years, since the 1880s, the next generation of Americans are likely to do worse. And what does that mean for your doubt? What does that mean? Worse than their parents, right? What does that mean in terms of your crises of modernity? Does it give you doubt about democracy, your vote, going to college, right? What else? Faith. all kinds of elements of these crises of modernity, Eikenberry argues, need to be confronted sort of as soon as possible, but there are also these challenges that seem impossible to confront, frankly, or incredibly hard, because there are structural factors that are outside of any one individual's ability to make significant change. Then the crisis of liberal democracy. That's where I kind of started. That liberal capitalist systems seem to be breaking down. You can think about rising inequality, including in social democracies in Europe. Right? Inequality is also rising there, just much lower than in the US. The ways in which some of the basic norms of democratic practices have broken down in many democratic countries, leading to the rise of authoritarian and far-right parties. One of the more fascinating of these in the international realm is Germany. For the first time, Germany has a vibrant right that actually talks about Nazism, which had been literally verboten. Right, it was not allowed; it was prohibited by threat of going to jail and large fines. And they are now openly talking about that past. Some of those parties, the main party has tried to buy one of Hitler's former homes and rehabilitate it, and they haven't been allowed by the local government. But that's a marker, just a small one, a marker of a big set of cultural changes that are traveling there in terms of liberal democracy breaking down. Right? If those strictures go, what else follows with it? Right? That's a huge kind of crisis of liberal democracy, and we're living with it here in the U.S. too. The fact that we can't have certain kinds of conversations, or Aaron and I were talking about, some of the kinds of laws that are getting passed that are about are nominally about free speech, but very often they're about constraining speech in the U.S. And so that's another way of thinking of it. The way that Eikenberry walks through these sets of questions and challenges is that he says that there's sort of three narratives in three areas of the world to think about as you think about these questions and concerns. The global West, us, the Western countries, the global East, that's led by sort of China and Russia, and the global South, all the normal countries you associate with them, but led by India, the BRICS countries. And his argument is that they all see these differently, and they're not any coherent kinds of blocks by any means, but that these different narratives lead to different configurations of countries supporting different kinds of policies. In other words, he argues that for some, the crisis of geopolitics is an opportunity, right? Russia, China. For some, the crisis of modernity it is a fact of life in the global South that hasn't developed in the way that the Western countries have, right? They don't have the same expectations about economics and security that we do in the US. So that's irrelevant in the ways from the profound ways that I was just expressing it as a kind of set of intractable problems given our privilege here, right? And then the crises of liberal democracy are seen as not just an opportunity, but in fact have been applauded by far-right governments and by governments in the global West, as well as in the global East and in the South. And the Israel-Palestine is a great example of the ways in which this is operated in the world system. So people see that conflict as akin to around the world, often in the global South, as akin to what happened in Ukraine. In other words, people see Israel acting towards the folks in Gaza as comparable to the ways that imperialist countries have often acted against smaller neighbors. And you can find this in polling in Brazil, in India, and elsewhere. And they associate then with sanctions against Russia as, in some of these cases, as being appropriate because they're acting like the imperialist against Ukraine. And so why are there not sanctions against Israel? Is the argument that this logic goes, right? This sort of global South plus some allies thinking about, well, what's going on in the system? And American policymakers have said in one case it's one thing, and in another case it's another. And they say, oh, America, you're hypocritical, and you're also an imperialist country and have a long history of that kind of thing, right? So in other words, Eikenberry is saying, hey, it's pretty complicated to try to figure out the configurations of the global south, global north, global west. They're moving, but don't assume that the logic that the West is applying or Americans apply is going to apply uniformly or universally in those other countries. That may be obvious, but just spelling out an example or two is quite useful because people around the world observing those two conflicts see a fundamentally different take from the global West in the two examples. The close hug of Israel in the one, and the sanctions and strictures and evil empire kind of talk about Russia in the other. All right, so like I said, I don't want to go too long. I've got a bunch of slides and thoughts here, but I also know we want to have a conversation. This rethinking of the U.S.'s role is nothing new. I would point us to the late 19th century as a fundamental moment of change and rupture. But there's a few other things that Eikenberry lays out that I wanted to kind of conclude with in terms of the decisions. So he argues, and I wrote a book about grand strategy, and I'm doing another one. If you want to come to a conference on grand strategy, come to Columbus in September. Got all these great speakers, former policymakers on rethinking American grand strategy for the 21st century. September 26th, 27th. Got a nice big grant. AI is part of it, so thinking about artificial intelligence as a threat and an opportunity. Climate change, the Arctic, space, we've got all kinds of fascinating areas to think about. All right, so let's say he says that there's three paths. I'm skeptical that there's only three paths. I think there's myriad paths that the US could take, but they lay out three in a nice sort of policy paper kind of way. And I think they're useful to think with. So the first is US world leadership on that old model. Just like after the Second World War, US-led international order. And what I wanted to do here, and though that's a lot of text, is just briefly say what he says the assumptions are about that. Because it's why I started with maybe there's something different to think about in terms of Pax Americana, but also how much are we invested in these assumptions. So one of the ways that we could think about the old US world leadership that's fracturing today, and its sort of Western-dominated elements, is that it comes from an even older system, sort of European, Eurocentric system, the Peace of Westphalia, the end of the 30 Years' War, and a set of views about how states should operate and state sovereignty operates that often privileged Europe and the West, and argued that there was a little less of that for other kinds of countries, sometimes for racist reasons, sometimes for power imbalance reasons. But that was built in to that. And that's why there's been wide skepticism about that leadership role in the world from the global South since World War II. But the core assumptions about it are why we see these arguments, why the great decisions starts with this, I would argue. So they say, okay, look, US world leadership has had more benefits than costs for the US. It's demonstrable in terms of market access. It's demonstrable in terms of doing better with, mostly economic indicators, but you can also talk about standard of living until the very recent past. You can talk about human flourishing until the recent past. Americans were polled and thought that they were doing better than others. They were happier than others. Now that Northern Europe has taken over those categories. So some of the core assumptions are that this first world leadership advanced American interests. That's now in doubt, but the history seems to suggest it did, in fact, advance U.S. interests. Second, that moment, mid-century, which I said was a unique moment in world history. I think that's become increasingly the consensus view by scholars. That moment where there was media consensus in the U.S., there were more facts that people agreed on, mass circulation, newspapers, Time and Life and all that. So there was a sort of core, homogenizing though it might have been, core of views, core of interpretations that most people subscribe to, that moment was unique in world history as well. The U.S. leadership, the devastation of Europe, of Japan, of China, meant that the U.S. had a place in the world system that no country ever had after such a devastating war. Another of the core assumptions, the third, is the sort of rule of law, open reciprocal trade, a commitment to democratic government, even commitments to human rights. That as that developed after the Second World War, you saw a real expansion of humanitarian aid and ways in which that US-led world system did, in fact, prioritize and privilege the sort of cultural factors in diplomacy and push them on other countries. Religious freedom is a great example of this. From World War II onward, the US demanded religious freedom in other countries more than it ever had. Yeah, I teach a class on religion and foreign relations. It's amazing to see how much U.S. diplomacy after World War II was about religious freedom, not just at home, and not just for American citizens when they traveled abroad, but for citizens of other countries, demanding it of countries including autocracies, dictatorships, et cetera. Not that it worked in all cases by any means, but that's a kind of example of a set of commitments that was seen to advance U.S. interests and is very much in doubt today, right? The current thinking, that middle path here, the sort of America first unilateralism, is don't mess with the sovereignty of other countries. It goes back to that a sort of set of views that it's up to them to decide if they want to discriminate against religious minorities or peoples and groups within their borders. But the U.S. world system said that was insufficient, that some human rights were greater than what national borders could operationalize. I would pick out another one. Unique responsibility to lead. I mean, this is a through line in all of U.S. history. I need not tell a group that's here to think about great decisions. But if you think about U.S. world leadership as it developed from, say, City on a Hill in 1629 and John Winthrop up to the very near past, a providential kind of a mission, a special mission, whether it's secular or divinely ordained, was really baked into how most American policymakers thought about their role in the hemisphere and then in the world. Whether or not they agreed to particular policies, they sometimes vigorously rejected them. That mission and unique mission for the U.S. was seen as part of the U.S.'s tenuous project, right? The scholars call it the creedal nation. No one was born American, indigenous folks excluded in this sense, but no one was born American in the American democratic sense. You joined it by believing the ideals. Unlike, there was a Russia before Russia, there was a France before France. This comes from Stanley Cavell and other thinkers. The U.S., no, tenuous project. You had to buy into that set of values, and that set of values led to a unique responsibility in the world, right? Something greater than. But also a sense of the ephemerality of it, a sense that this project could fail, right? So if you read Washington and Adams and Jefferson in the early years, right, they're really worried. There's enemies everywhere. All right, sort of to move back through, and the last two are pretty obvious in our contemporary moment. That alliances, partnerships, and institutions were really crucial, and that deep worldwide global engagement helped the U.S. So that's a set of commitments that many people shared, many policymakers, establishment folks, up until not long ago. The other two that Eichenberry lays out that I think are also worth noting is our current moment's America First, unilateralism, transactionalism, and retrenchment. This is essentially, and I've traced this in my studies of isolationism, this is a through line in U.S. foreign policy all the way. I mean, I argue that unilateralism is the default setting of U.S. foreign policy. When in doubt, American policymakers have said, does it support our special interests? If not, we won't do it. If it does, we will do it on our own. We may do it with allies, may not. That's where the U.S. has tended to go, especially in moments of crisis, because it allows for quicker action, generally speaking, and it allows for an articulation of core values that doesn't include other people. It's often limited. We could talk through more of these. I'm sure we're all pretty aware of this, but the core ideas of America First, and we just heard it from the Defense Secretary, is actually decreasing the U.S.'s military footprint. 8% out of the military budget every year for the next 5 years is what they just announced. Retrenching from world commitments, pulling back from bases and base structures, pulling out of all those deals that I put up on the screen before, right? Threatening NATO if member nations don't pay up, as Donald Trump would put it, and essentially prioritizing a set of values that are more insular within the nation state. This goes all the way back. You can find it in Washington's farewell address in 1796, elements of it, right, to steer clear of foreign entanglements. And Jefferson reified that in 1801. But what I've been talking about for several decades is that this American population, when polled on some of the core values about America First, supports them. Whether you like that or don't like that, it's true. Not spending on foreign aid, for instance, right? Though it's a minuscule part of the federal budget, Americans tend not to like that in the abstract. Poll after poll suggests that. In the particular, they do like it, which is interesting. I often ask policymakers this. So if you say the U.S. is going to help Haiti, Americans, and you show them pictures of suffering in Haiti, Americans will support that. If you say the U.S. is going to help Central and South America, they will not by a majority. So there's an interesting disconnect in how Americans even think about aid. But in general, many of these core principles of this second set are widely agreed on, and it's why, in some ways, we are in the moment now thinking about these grand strategies. Eikenberry's favored path, which I will quickly lay out, is a kind of updated version of a concert of Europe. By this he means a balance of power. We talk about this BOP in the world that I exist in. A balance of power between nations that will include liberal and illiberal countries. So he's saying the U.S. should potentially work closely with China, work closely with Hungary, work closely with Russia, if it's possible, to have a kind of a set of international agreements, norms, and processes that minimizes conflict and maybe maximizes outcomes, whatever those might be. So his sort of compromised middle path is some combination of the two, where the U.S. could not have as much of a military diplomatic footprint, not have as many binding commitments to the world, but still operate with other countries for collective best interests. He doesn't say it here, but the way I'm thinking about that is the next pandemic. That the U.S. might not agree on how it should deal with a conflict in terms of Palestinians, and so would stay out, or a future action with Ukraine. But the U.S. will clearly have its population impacted by the next pandemic, and so in a kind of this middle path sense, should be part of the WHO, although, again, this is not the Trump administration's view, but this is what Eikenberry is laying out, should be part of the World Health Organization, should be sharing scientific information with other countries. So that's his idea, that you could have a kind of concert of collective deliberation and diplomacy that might mean that we could chart a path of the U.S.'s role in the world that led in some areas, partnered in others, and retrenched in the final set of categories. So I'll sort of just end with the fact that I started with. Is this the end of the world order? People are decrying it all the time. Tons of books have come out, talks, events. I just grabbed a handful of headlines. This is the most difficult global outlook since the 30s. Can the world order catch up with the world? We're waking up to a new world order. What does the world order even mean? Right? We could spend another hour just talking through all of that. And then, to some extent, what are the prescriptions for the U.S. if there is a new world order? So foreign policy folks have been thinking for a while about what does it mean to manage decline. If you just agree that the U.S. is in some state of decline relative to other countries, how do you manage that? What are the best ways to think about managing that? As a rhetorical strategy, like as a leader, how do we talk about it? Because the U.S. is used to the rhetoric of exceptionalism. How do we talk about it in terms of international collaboration and cooperation? What are the limits in terms of hard power? The U.S. still has the greatest military in the world. When does it deploy them if the U.S. is a declining power? The U.S. obviously can't afford another Iraq and Afghanistan, so it has to be limited. But you also could argue that as a declining power, the U.S., and with as much power as it has, the U.S. should use its capacities. So these are all open questions in the best sense of the decision series. I could go on, but I want to leave us some time to talk. So thank you all for having me.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you again. That was very, very insightful and very thorough and interesting. So we do have time for Q&A. So I'll bring the mic back to you so everybody can hear. So who would like to start us off with a question or a comment or whatever?
Love a good political cartoon, so I'll toss another one up.
I'll risk starting, I guess.
Sure.
Several times you alluded to a kind of religious thematics throughout history. Mitch McConnell just is retiring this year. He's been perceived as one of the institutionalists of our system of government, which seems to be becoming a past commitment.
Yep.
I wonder how you view, and this is an almost impossible question to answer because it means diving into the heads of those who govern and those who run for office and so forth. But it seems like there's less and less a commitment to working within the bounds of the system, the processes, and rather more of a commitment to simply being elected and then exercising power of that office which are two very different ways of approaching, the running of something. I don't know if there's any real comment on that, but you might have some wisdom on that.
Well, I think it's a great, well, there's at least two connections you're making there. One between the sort of faith of leaders and their faith in institutions. And, one thing that's interesting is if you're teaching and reading, go back to some fireside chats and think about the connections that Franklin Delano Roosevelt made about the way that American institutions could and will endure even in the crisis of the Depression, and a kind of faith in those institutions that many thought was misplaced, and that in fact sort of was grounded then in that world order that comes out of World War II. You simply do not hear that from as many policymakers today. You could argue on both sides of the aisle, but then the question would be more, how do they actually, when the rubber hits the road, how do they govern, right? And I think your point about governing through the use of power is an interesting one. It's sort of always true, is a truism in political history. But I think I would add at the faith-based piece, there, in US political history, shame has often operated as a very effective way of getting your ends as a population from leaders. And if leaders did things that were seen in a poor light, being diplomatic, the population, there would be direct results, right? That either from their peers who were elected, who would pressure them out, think of Nixon, or from the population at large, who simply would not vote them back in. The sorts of norms about shame and proper behavior from politicians have been shattered. The last lifetime, they're just gone in the last generation. And I don't think we can get them back. What was a scandal for Bill Clinton would be something that could be survived in one news cycle today, right? Though there's a weaponizing of certain scandals in different ways, as you're noting, right? Politicians no longer are between the faith in themselves and the faith in the institutions and the ways that the electorate operates. There's not as much of that anymore. Yeah. I wish I had some real wisdom. Those are just observations. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Question? Oh.
That's interesting in the whole issue of shame, because I know I've been having discussions among...
There's a hand, or there's a mic behind you. Yes, if you go raise your hand, we'll get, I'm sure they'll get you in a minute. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, in the briefing book, the article, somewhere along the middle of the article, he starts talking about different approaches, and one of them is Westphalian, and which he just throws in with no definition. And so I went and looked up Westphalia to see what this was all about. And as best I can understand, he's understanding it as kind of a middle way of, dealing with international relations, historically related to an agreement between the Holy Roman Empire and some nation states back in, can't remember whether it was 1600s or 1700s, it's been a while. But I thought that was kind of interesting. And I think some sort of a middle solution is probably a valuable idea.
Yep. That's what I was trying to paint in that third path that he lays out, right? So the idea is that coming out of the 30 Years' War and then is the first sort of piece that he's talking about, that the countries of Europe agreed through a balance of power system to not invade each other, to not worry about the Catholics versus Protestants in the same sorts of ways. And so in international relations circles, we refer to that as this sort of BOP, a balance of power system, where you don't have a hegemonic force, where you don't have the primacy of an actor with outsized military capacity. So his argument there is, as in the way that I was describing, how do you manage decline? If the U.S. slowly doesn't have its same superiority in military and commercial areas, then a sort of Westphalian system would make sense, where the U.S. would be, you could think of it as a constellation. It's like, right, there's a North Star, maybe that's the U.S. in the new system, but there's a whole lot of other stars out there that shine bright and you could see in the system, and they're not intersecting and meddling with each other. They're doing their own thing. And you can even think about it in a kind of astrological cycle, when some are more visible at different moments or shine brighter and some don't, some are closer and some are farther. That's the kind of system he's hoping for. But the challenge there is with the two first ones, the US-led world order and the sort of America First vision, it's hard to imagine you get to the balance of power, Peace of Westphalia, in our current trajectory. Like, he doesn't explain how you might do that, and I don't know how you make that leap. Certainly in our current administration, our current moment right now, that seems unlikely. But it could be, you also have to entertain the possibility that that's on the horizon, because other actors in the system, the US isn't the only one. I mean, another way to think about our whole conversation is American decisions are always conditioned on the decisions of other peoples and groups, right? And we often talk as if American-centric decisions and US great decisions are the decisive factors in the world system, but that is not the case. And in fact, all of the examples that I've given, practically all the contemporary examples I've given, were imposed on the US, right? The US had no idea Hamas would attack and no idea how Israel would respond. The US had no idea that Russia was going to invade Ukraine until right before. And then when the U.S. started talking about it, people didn't believe the U.S. Like, the signals intelligence is saying they're about to attack, and even the Ukrainians weren't sure, right? So that's another way to think about what that Westphalian system might look like, with the U.S. maybe not as the North Star or as a major part of the constellation, but as maybe a smaller player in it. So this gentleman had.
I think Randy had his hand up first. And I'll
okay,
over to you.
go for it.
Procedures, all right. I'll give it right over to you then.
Yeah.
I don't know how international this is, but I guess the whole issue about shame not working in politics is, I think, insightful in the current moment, in that any political action that is based on that is also ineffective, like protests.
Yep.
Almost no matter how big a protest is, it's ineffective in that situation. And so I guess if there's a international aspect and question out of what I'm saying, is to what extent can we look at both the domestic environment for individuals and in terms of foreign policy interrelations, how can we look to countries that were second or third tier in the past, and how the population dealt with being in that role? How does a person achieve personal prosperity or effectiveness if you live in a Latin American country 50 years ago? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And how does that perspective inform us today in terms of what we can do?
Yeah. So in the first part, one of the things that I think a lot about in terms of the intersection of domestic and foreign policy is that there are ways. So I was referring to shame in the most obvious sense of political scandals, bribes, sexual innuendo, whatever problems, a whole host of things, right? But there are traveling companions to that in terms of protests and other actions that do have some demonstrable real-world effects still. Politicians, for instance, don't often, being tarred as racist, even for across the political spectrum, there's a level of shame that they don't like. So when protests allege that a leader is racist, they try to push back. You've seen this with the back and forth on anti-Semitism, for instance. So there's that element, and protests can be effective as sort of spectacular actions that show that a view that's being alleged to be majority or very popular, in fact, isn't. So that's even in our contemporary moment. It's just that it's much harder to move the needle, but it may always have been. I mean, I think protests as political drivers it's really hard to find a one-to-one correlation between immediate protest and then a political set of changes. It's often, we talk about the long civil rights movement, which starts in Reconstruction or starts with abolition. It's not just the mid 20th century. But the other question is interesting. I don't quite fully know how to answer it, but I would say, Americans have grown. We've all, people in the U.S., members of the community who aren't even American, recent immigrants, undocumented folks in the U.S. often quickly take on the cultural components of the U.S. as deciding key elements of the world system. Even those who are the least advantaged in American society. So it's incredibly hard for us in the U.S. to imagine being in a nation state that, for instance, doesn't have a grand strategy, right? The way that we define it, IR theorists, political scientists, historians, right? Argentina didn't have enough power to have a grand strategy. But the U.S., Britain, Russia did. So even the ways that we talk about those things would be foreign to impute into your average Argentinian in another era, sort of thing, to think about that. But to think about the role in the world, one of the things, one of the groups that I studied that I think is really fascinating is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILP. So the first two American women to win the Nobel Peace Prize were in it, Jane Addams and Emily Balch. And they had chapters all around the world in lots of countries that had no power. And they empowered people in those chapters, women of color, all kinds of folks, different religious groups, to advocate in their societies for world peace. And actually, in the 20s, they were part of getting the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact signed by a whole bunch of countries to outlaw war. For us, looking back, that sounds idealistic and naive, but actually in the moment, coming out of the First World War, I would argue, as a set of transnational actors and domestic people pushing a cause in the world system, it's pretty amazing to get France and Britain and the US to sign on to a pact to outlaw war. And what I'm drawing out of this historical example is that people in countries with relatively no power in the League of Nations were pushing through transnational networks the human rights that they thought that they deserved and wanted people in the rest of the world to have. And so while we, on the one hand, privilege sort of the American grand strategy and great decisions, on the other hand, our individual actions in concert with others in countries that have more or less power can be really profound. So your average Argentinian in 1920 could have been part of that league and pushing for something really meaningful.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time maybe for one more brief question. We have to be respectful of time. So there it is.
I'm here until you dismiss me.
Oh, maybe I should talk to you after.
Go ahead and ask.
Brief, but one example historically was when the Soviet Union.
Want to use the
hear
mic?
me?
I can, but I don't know if
When the Soviet Union collapsed and all the
Yeah.
nuclear weapons were unaccounted for, and everybody thought, they could be anywhere in
Yep.
the world. It was only really one country that was able to control that.
Yeah.
The United States was probably the only one possible to collect all that and almost verify where everything was and secure it safely. And I just wonder, as events in the world happen,
Yeah.
people are just going to stop and look towards us anyway. You've got to solve it.
Yeah.
And so, the three possible new things, I don't know out of the other two whether or not, securing those nuclear weapons would have happened in that sort of system.
Yeah. No, it certainly wouldn't. I mean, the U.S.'s role in securing the nuclear weapons, that's a great example of the core commitments that Eikenberry talked about and I was elaborating, right? That it benefits the U.S. That it's part of a rules-based order. It's, core principles, all kinds of stuff. So in that sense, that was the Biden administration's, their catchphrase was "America is back" in trying to renew those same kinds of commitments. I think about this all the time. If you're a world leader right now, and then regardless of your politics, if you're a world leader right now, you look at the U.S., you can't possibly think that the U.S. will maintain a stable relationship in terms of what it's pledged to do in the past and will continue to do in the future. Right? There's a lot of ways that we could talk through the nuances of that. But the fundamental fact is the U.S. is no longer a reliable ally. And so how do countries around the world deal with that? In the NATO and Ukraine example, Europe has to figure out how much it's going to backstop that. So the counterfactual would be, if there's loose nukes now, Europe has to deal with it, right? NATO has to deal with it. Maybe the U.S. is a small player. So there's still possibilities. I think my colleague John Muller would say, where I started with this skepticism, in the absence of the U.S.-led world order, it still might have turned out okay. So he would say, look, the system can survive these shocks, just other players have to step up. So that the U.S. did that is great, but Germany and France and Britain could have done it too. They just didn't because they had the U.S. to do it. Now, would they have done it, right? I don't know. Like we can't go back through that history. Would they step up to a power vacuum now? Quite possibly in terms of Ukraine, maybe not in terms of Israel, or pick another example, China, right? And then the other problem is the values piece. That's where I run aground, right? So there simply aren't the same shared values in liberal and illiberal democracies and countries. And so if you care about human rights in particular ways, or religious freedoms, that's the one I pick all the time. But if you care about women's rights, right, there are not the players in the international system to try to enforce those if the U.S. is an unreliable actor or an unwilling actor, frankly, in terms of those categories. That's what I think the first level set of changes we're seeing is already, right? The U.S. is not standing up for Afghan women, even though the U.S. fought an incredibly long war in Afghanistan. Now, could it? Should it? Who knows, right? Or we could have a long discussion about that. But that it chooses not to is significant. That's pessimistic. I should say, I agree partly with my colleague John. I think the U.S. can come through these shocks, and the system also can come through these shocks and weather them. But the key to the great decisions here is, I think, for now, it's still revolving around the first and the second. How much will the second, how much will the America First retrenchment limit the possibilities of U.S. leadership, or change them to partnership, which is what people around the world have been calling for a long time. Hey, just partner. The collective action, you don't have to lead, you don't need a bully pulpit, collaborate, right? Maybe there's more of that if you want to be optimistic and say non-proliferation questions.
All right, thank you very much. Any last comments before we wrap up a last thing? Jan. Oh, no, you're not Jan, sorry. Yes.
I think the present administration is going to do to the State Department what it's doing to other parts of the government.
Yeah, so the question is, will the current administration do the State Department what it's been doing? My colleagues and friends in the State Department and former ambassadors and folks like that are certain of it.
All right, with that, let me just say thank you. And I think it's true. Let me say thank you on all of our behalf for coming up today. Quick thing as you all prepare to leave, one thing, are you still able to join us for lunch today?
Yes, yeah, I'll be here.
Okay, so if anybody would like to, we have space for probably maybe 15 people total over at Amato's in the back room. You're welcome to join us.